Welcome to Americana Archives. Today's headline is Confederate Make-Shifts. It says, every household became a nest of domestic manufactures. Every farm had its cotton patch and its sorghum field. Spinning wheels and looms, which in former days had been used for clothing the slaves on large plantations, but which during the era of cheap dry goods were comparatively idle, were again set going. Ladies whose white hands were all unused to such labor learned to card, to spin, and to weave. Knitting became as fashionable in southern parlors as it is in German homes. Homespun dresses were worn by the first ladies in the land, and she who was cleverest to contrive and deftest to execute had highest praise from her associates. Foreign dyes were well nigh unattainable, and the woods at home were ransacked for the means of coloring the homegrown flax, wool, and cotton. Black walnut bark furnished a rich brown, varying in intensity with the strength of the dye. Swamp maple a clear purple, pokeberries a sulphurino bright but not durable. Wild indigo gave a tolerable blue, and elderberries an unsatisfactory black. Indeed, no experiment with bark, root, leaf, or berry ever resulted in any substitute for logwood, and as black as the dye most needed for southern garments in those dark days, the blockade runners learned to make it a part of their regular cargo. At one time, in some sections of the South, there was fearful destitution of salt. Speculators held it at enormous prices. Even the rich were forced to use it sparingly. The poor seemed likely to suffer for the want of it, and livestock were in many cases denied it altogether. Barrels and boxes, which had been used for packing salt fish or pork, were soaked in water afterward, which was boiled down and evaporated for the sake of the salt thus extracted. The carven floors of smokehouses, into which the precious mineral had been trodden year after year, were dug up, and the earth given to cattle or treated with water after the same manner as the salt season boards. The government at Richmond came to the rescue, and seizing the salt works throughout the country, issued regular rations to each family at nominal prices for the rest of the war. By this high-handed measure, the people were saved from a salt famine. Coffee was a luxury seldom enjoyed, and for which rye or wheat, toasted and ground, was the usual miserable substitute. Some quick-witted person conceived the idea of using sweet potato chips instead. These made a more palatable drink, but were, after all, only a hollow mockery. Dried raspberry leaves were used for tea, and some people fell back upon sassafras, the North Carolinian beverage, grimly assuring those who scorned it that it was good for the blood and would save doctors' bills. Not a few eschewed all these transparent deceptions, if that may be called deception, which deceived nobody, and when unable to afford milk, drank cold water with patient heroism. Prominent among the problems with which Confederate families were forced to grapple was that of lights. The gas works in the principal cities were kept in operation, but the gas furnished was of the poorest quality, exuberantly dear. Many private families were unable to afford its use, and the few who could pay for it were not always sure of getting it. On more than one occasion, in crowded churches, pastor and people were given a practical illustration of Egyptian darkness, and on one memorable night, the gas in Richmond gave out simultaneously all over the city, in all buildings, public and private, leaving those who depended upon its illuminating powers in total darkness. Pine torches, in southern parlance, light wood knots, were to be had in plenty, and in winter their ruddy glow was comfortable and picturesque. But work or reading done by their flickering light was a terrible strain on the eyes, and the heat from the blazing wood was uncomfortable in summer. Moreover, the pitch smoke was objectionable and blackened the walls. Tallow candles were the usual resort, and were surprisingly hard and white. Old-fashioned lard lamps came again into use for parlors and state occasions, giving a soft, clear luster, much like that of the favorite French lamp. But lard was costly and scarce. For sick rooms and nurseries, and for mills, where the machinery ran all night, but where bright light was not constantly required, the balls of the sycamore or buttonwood tree were dried and used as a wick in a cup of melted grease. During a tedious case of typhoid in the family of the writer, a friend introduced a taper so safe and satisfactory as to merit use in other than war times. A small triangular scrap of soft paper is twisted into a species of miniature fool's cap, the hypotenuse of the triangle forming its base. This, with the knob on top oiled and lighted, and the lower part spread out like a fan, is inserted as a wick in a small saucer of lard. There is no unpleasant odor, and it gives a dim light by which objects in the room are barely distinguishable, but from which a lamp may be instantly lighted. Near the taper, its light is sufficient to tell the hour by a watch, to read the label on a vial, and to measure medicine with ease. But the Confederate candle was beyond all else the light of those days. Wax and resin were melted together in the proportion of 2 ounces of resin to a pound of wax, and through this mixture a long string of candle wick was drawn once and again until thoroughly coated. Making one was always a frolic for the younger members of a household, and occasionally furnished excuse for an afternoon party. It was a matter of pride to have the candle as long as possible, and the work was always done out of doors. The saucepan or skillet containing the wax rested on a shovelful of hot coals. The ball of wick was unrolled and passed through the liquid, and from hand to hand until every inch of it had been immersed 3 times, and the long irregular string became a smooth waxen rope about the thickness of an ordinary lead pencil. This was then wound on a wooden stand, the Confederate candlestick, first around, then up and down. The free end was drawn through a hole in a strip of tin nailed for the purpose on the upper part of the candlestick, and when the candle in use was lighted, the long rope unwinding like a reel of yarn as it was gradually consumed. The light was, perhaps, not more than equal to that of a toy candle, yet it was not trying to the eyes, and was sufficient for ordinary purposes. The place next the scarce pan was the post of honor and of danger. The wick was held down in the wax by means of a small crotched stick, but in spite of this precaution, burned fingers were not unfrequently the result of the candle making. This article was written by Mrs. M.P. Handy in Harper's Magazine for March. This story came from the great state of Iowa, being reported in the Iowa State Reporter of March 8, 1876. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.